Welcome to Murder, Mystery, Misdirection, the case of Indian detective fiction. Today, the panelists will be talking about how Indian cities and towns became integral characters in mystery stories and what makes Indian detective fiction a genre like no other. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Um, After award-winning career in advertising, Neeti Shroff Shah ventured into writing full-time with articles in India Today, The Mint, and Condé Nast Traveler. Her first book was the well-received memoir, Do You Know Any Good Boys? Her successive books were critically acclaimed. A Mumbai murder mystery made it to long list of CWA New Blood Dagger Award 2022, and the death of Kirti Kadakia was part of the 2023 Times of India Author Award shortlist. Um, Kiran Mandral is an author, speaker, and mentor. Her novels traverse various genres from horror and psychological thrillers to detective fiction and nonfiction. She has also written columns for Times of India, Scroll, The Telegraph, and Cosmopolitan, and short stories for anthologies such as Chicken Soup for the Soul, The Best Asian Speculative Fiction, and City of Screams. Tarun K. Sent, an independent Indian scholar born in Kenya, has interests in partition literature, science fiction, and detective fiction. His works include authoring Witness Partition, Memory, History Fiction, editing Bruised Memories, and co-editing anthologies like Translating Partition, Looking Back, India's Partition 70 Years On, the Golan Book of South Asian Science Fiction, Avatar, Kalicalypse, Ecocenic Global South SF, and the two-volume Hatchet Book of Indian Detective Fiction. Finally, our moderator this evening is Manish Dubey. Manish is Chief Practice Program at IIHS. Manish provides strategic direction and guidance to consolidate and grow the program portfolio and team in line with the overall mission and strategic vision of IIHS. Manish's engagement with public issues through media commentary has translated to the publishing of over 100 opinion pieces and articles on politics, society, and cricket in digital and print. He has also authored 2 books of crime fiction and has spoken on literary matters and his personal creative journey on several fora. So over to you, Manish.
So thank you for coming over. So I really can't think many ways of spending a Saturday afternoon, many better ways of spending a Saturday afternoon listening to people who plan crime and solve crime, which is what crime fiction authors do. As readers, we might be impressed with the deviousness of the criminal mind or the trickiness of the suspect's mind or the brilliance of a detective. But useful to remember that there's only one mind behind it all, and that's the authors. So we've got 3 authors, 3 minds, such minds, in conversation, and they're going to be talking about crime, murder, detectives, and because this is IIHS, and because detective fiction would be the social novel of our time, murder and detectives in Indian cities. You heard about all the cool stuff that they do and write about. We are going to be, today the spotlight is going to be on the murders, on the detective fiction. So Meeti's Temple Hill series, Kiran's K-Mera series, and the 2 volumes of Indian detective fiction that Tarun has recently put out. We'll talk about those. Tarun, I'll start with you. Your 2 volumes, they really pack a lot of stuff. There are 36 stories. They're in various settings, from rural to Mofussil to metropolitan. You have authors living and dead, both in the book. So Tarun, I'll repeat my question. Your 2 volumes, they pack a lot of stuff, right? You've got 36 odd stories. You've got authors living and dead on it. The stories are set in everything from rural to Mofussil to metropolitan. They are set in times that are long gone by. They are set in current times. They are set in times yet to come. So vast territory. And you've lived with these stories for a while, and you must have waded into many, many more. What I wanted to ask you was, how do you see the broad evolutionary arc of Indian detective fiction, particularly in terms of the settings and the character of the detective?
Okay, thanks for that. Interesting question. Right. So I'll sort of begin by speaking a little bit about the process of first, yes, mapping, as it were, the archive, which is quite a long-standing one, which dates back to the colonial era. So I undertook this exercise to begin with as a necessary step in historical, as it were, recovery of whole genre history, in effect, which began with the publication of Goenda magazine. Goenda is the Bengali term for detective. So in the 1890s, just shortly after the Sherlock Holmes stories became so popular in England. So in the 1890s, they began adapting and translating Holmes. And as a result, these Goenda magazines were published. We have one such story in our collection, Sharat Chandra Sarkar's story, which is an adaptation of The Adventure of the Beryl Coronet. But these were largely attempts at basically situating that form in an Indian context without much, say, use of the indigenous imagination to begin with. But subsequently, with a greater degree of, as it were, localization, with a greater degree of familiarity with the rules of the genre. We must remember that, after all, detective fiction as a genre has a very unique kind of structure compared to other forms. It's a structure which allows for some kind of cerebral element to come into play. And this was there right from the time of 1841, when Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Murders in the Rue Morgue, subsequently enhanced even further by Conan Doyle in the case of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and subsequently by the Golden Age writers like Agatha Christie. So the idea of the game has always been crucial, and the idea of a certain degree of playfulness as the readers attempt to solve the crime, which finally is usually sort of solved by the extremely intelligent and almost, well, it's the detective endowed with almost superhuman power. So that's been a kind of aspect of this sort of structure of the genre right from the early stage. And this, I think, was very much retained in the Indian context as well, right up to the time of Ray and Sharadendu Bandyopadhyay. Satyajit Ray, of course, gave the form a certain kind of dignity. It's unique, I think, to the Bengali context that such a luminary would take an interest in this kind of popular form, as it were. I don't think we see that in any other part of the country, which is perhaps why the genre didn't quite take off to the extent that it did in Bengal. So Bengal is the richest and most interesting, perhaps, tradition, and probably the reason why we have no less than 7 translations in this anthology, starting with Sharat Chandra Sarkar, also including that wonderful parody of the form by Rabindranath Tagore, who actually comes up with the parody in 1898. The Goenda magazine I was speaking of was published in 1895. And Tagore is able to parody the form. In fact, he comes up with this brilliant idea that the reason why we really can't have such a thriving dimension of that detective fiction in our context is because our villains are so boring. You need to have a strong undercurrent of evil in a society, which England certainly does have. So he takes the mickey out of the English rulers, and maybe also pokes fun at the formulaic aspect of detective fiction. But he says at the end of the day, yes, his very inept detective strives to kind of solve puzzles in his own kind of way, but fails miserably. But it's an interesting case of a parody even before the form has quite cemented itself in the imagination. So I would say that there are therefore these 2 tendencies. One kind of more conservative tendency, staying with the traditional form, which we've been speaking about, the clue puzzle structure, the solving of the crime by the very intelligent detective, who certainly shares a certain kind of sensibility with the reader, who's supposed to be able to match his wits, as it were, with the detective figure. But at the end of the day, the reader is somewhere between the sidekick, the Watson figure, and the detective. Whether it's Topshe and Peluda or other figures subsequently down the line. So that's the perhaps more conservative side. Then there's a more interesting, perhaps, different sort of side, which is more experimental, where detective fiction veers towards psychological questions. And this follows the trajectory of Western crime fiction as well, where it becomes more experimental, and the form allows for social commentary to a greater extent. The quotient of violence also perhaps gets increased. So in India too, I think we've seen that in more recent times, a greater degree of self-referentiality and awareness of the history of the form, in especially the more contemporary life, which we've also tried to present in this work.
Okay, thanks. That's useful. And I'll come back to some of the sort of the different geographies of detective fiction later in this conversation. But, you know, Tarun spoke, and Miti, this is for you. Tarun's talking about different kinds of how the stories have evolved, the conventional and the experimental, and so on and so forth. But if there's one thing that's remained consistent in detective fiction, pretty much from the time people started writing it and from across the world, is murder. Somebody's got to die. Mar raha hai kisi ko. Now, if you look at it statistically, I mean, every murder is an abomination. Having said that, murders don't happen as much as detective fiction would make us believe. You know, they're not as common. There are many, many crimes that happen far more frequently. And the amateur detectives, who have generally shouldered the burden of this genre in some senses, actually spend most of their time snooping around spouses and business rivals and whatnot. Fine? They don't really look into murder. But detective fiction is fixated on murder. Your two books are about murder. Your story in Tarun's collection is about the prospect of murder. Fine? In your case, and in more generally, where does this sort of, why does murder have to happen? Why does it have to be about murder?
So I think a murder is the most nicest, cleanest crime possible.
Okay?
So I don't like anything explicit or graphic on my pages. So I don't want my mind to go to crime against women or children, because you know, when say you're talking about a child getting kidnapped, then you have to deal with the repercussions. The novel has to deal with the repercussions of that crime. Whereas I'm writing a traditional mystery. So I want to introduce the crime. We're not going to describe it in any gory detail because I don't think that's fun. In the first few pages, we talk about the crime, and we're out of there. The novel, the mystery, the traditional mystery actually dwells on the world of the crime. Has the murder happened at a beauty pageant? Has it happened at a restaurant? Or has it happened, like in my latest book, it's happening at a matrimonial bureau? So we're going to look at that world. We're going to look at the people who inhabit that world. We're going to ask questions about why, their motives, about why they would choose to do something like this. So those are the areas I'm interested in exploring, you know, the motives. So for my purpose, a murder works well. There's a dead body, the police comes and investigates, police is tougher, and then starts the amateur detective comes in. And the novel is about the culture and of the world that we're evoking in this book. Also, second to this is the stakes have to be big enough for you as a reader to be invested for 300 pages. There has to be a big crime involved, and murder fits it for me. Like, it's perfect. Chef's kiss.
Okay. No, so I quite get the point about getting the reader invested. Nobody's going to read 300 pages about missing cutlery. So I get that. So that's fine. And yeah, murder can be clean in some senses, paradoxically so, but yeah. But Kiran, I want to come to you on this. Is there any other reason why murder would be so central to detective fiction? For example, I mean, the one reason I can think of is perhaps all of us here have contemplated कि यार इसको मार देते किसी something. I don't know. Is there a repressed violence? Is there a repressed sort of rage in all of us? I mean, of course, we won't act on it. But does fiction play to that sentiment, at least try to sort of connect with that inner rage, etc.? Maybe that's one reason. And I'm asking you this question because in The Reluctant Detective, there is this particular passage, it's just about half a page. It talks about bone and tissue and blood and all that. But it doesn't descend into crime porn of any kind. It just stays there. But it does convey the gravity of the crime without getting too gory about it. So, yeah, so that question, basically, you know, this whole question of violence, how central is it? Why is it so central? Is there any other dimension to it? And your treatment of violence in your books.
I think we're all terrified of being murdered someday or the other. And we've given enough people cause sometime or the other in our lives.
Correct.
Apart from that, I think all fiction is voyeuristic. Whether it's theater, whether it's a movie, an OTT series, we are trying to get some catharsis out of what we read or what we view. And a murder, in the sense, is a final, as Meeti says. It's the final. It's the biggest thing you could do to somebody to ruin their lives completely. I mean, you leave no life left. So what's beyond that? About my books, I don't get very graphic in these books because they are comic mysteries. They're not pure detective fiction. There's no forensics involved. My detective is a bumbling housewife who's sort of stumbling across clues. But sometimes, as you say, you just want to convey the gravity of what has happened and, you know, that this is no joke. Someone has died and there is blood spilled and there is a body that's there and life has gone out of the body. At that point, I think you just need to bring in that element to make the reader aware that, okay, this is serious stuff. Even though everything is ha-ha, hee-hee throughout the book, but this is bad, this is gory. And even though I'm not going to describe, you know, it in great detail, you need to be worried about that person. No one in my books is invested in the person who has died. I think no one in any detective fiction is invested very much in the dead body per se. They're invested in how the detective is going to get at the root of the entire murder, why did the how, what, where, how, about the murder. So the emotional investment is not in the murder, it's in the detective, in the persona of the detective. And that's what makes detective fiction so interesting to us, because we imagine that, okay, perhaps we could also do this if we had a chance sometime.
Yeah, I've thought about it. So,
We all are.
but I'm glad you brought this sort of point on the character of the detective. And Meeti, I'll come to you about Radhika. You know, your Temple Hill series is as much about Radhika solving murders as it is about the baggage she carries and the journey she's on. And that's pretty much in keeping with how the detective character has evolved over time. You know, earlier you had detective characters who were sort of a little pompous, eccentric, and they were focused on solving crimes. And increasingly now you have characters who have their own torments about health and relationships and whatnot, and they also do crimes, right? Also do sort of solve crimes. And Radhika is in that category. But do you sometimes worry that, you know, this tormented, disturbed, whatever, I mean, this sort of principal detective character, so carrying some baggage, takes away from the colorful detectives that we are used to from the past and detracts from the pace of the story?
I think for me, when I'm reading mystery as a reader, I am interested in the intellectual puzzle of the case, the world that the book is set in, as well as the detective. I'm invested in the detective personally. So for me to read a series and to see the detective grow, there has to be some growth. There has, you know, because we as people have backstories, right? We've come with this baggage, old fears, some trauma that we may be dealing with, regrets that we've lived. Also, when we are going about our day-to-day lives, who's to say I'm not thinking about the fight I had with my husband right now? You know, I'm talking to you, but I mean, who knows, right? Like,
Sure.
so why shouldn't the detective have a inner monologue going on as she's solving the crime? It makes her more believable, makes her more relatable. I invest in such detectives more. And I think as to the pacing of the story, uh, it's a give and take. I mean, there are readers who really, there are all kinds of readers. There are readers who want a page turner and they're like, please do not tell us why her heart is broken. We don't care. We just want to know who killed. You know, and then there are other readers who like that gentleness of the pace. It's a slow burn mystery.
Sure.
You know, so I think it's a give and take. You can't please everybody. I write for myself, you know, the kind of stuff I like to read, and I want to know what's happening. Is she thinking about what she's going to wear? You know, while the crime is happening, but she has a date in the night, and I want to know what's going on in her head. And it can't all be crime. That would be a sociopath, you know, so.
Okay. So maybe when we open the floor to the audience, I think people would want to weigh in on this, on the kind of pace, etc., and the kind of character that they have preferences for, and maybe can reflect on that question. But I'll come to K. Mehra now, right? K is, and the K. Mehra series is pretty unusual in many ways. One, it is a laugh riot. It's really funny. I mean, detective fiction usually isn't. It's like really funny. Second is Kay herself, you know, I mean, she plays multiple roles. She's a wife, mom, she wants to go back to her work, she's, you know, a detective, she's a friend, etc., etc. Multiple roles. She takes all, daughter, she takes all those roles very seriously. And yet, there is this breeziness to her, you know, and she's not over ponderous about this. She takes her role seriously, she's not over ponderous. The third thing that strikes me about the Chimera books is they're not really respectful of the formula that we have sort of for detective fiction. So you have at least two of Knox's commandments are broken in your two books. And this whole P.D. James thing of 50%, yeah, and 25% character and 25% what you know based doesn't work in that. But how did you actually come to sort of give Kay this very unique character and voice and attitude? I mean, like I said, it's very unusual for detective fiction to do that.
So that's a very, very interesting question. How did I come to give Kay that character and voice? I don't think I really planned it. I was just starting out writing a funny story about a schoolgate mom who had nothing to occupy herself with. I think I was in that space at that time. It was around 10, 12 years ago. I was a schoolgate mom and taking my kid to school, and I saw all the women around me. Many of them had dropped out of the professional space to care for their kids. I mean, that leaky pipeline we all keep talking about. Everybody looking for purpose and nothing to occupy themselves with. And questions, gossip, I mean, talking to each other. And that was the archetype of the persona I wanted to create. So K. Mehra came from that space in my life. And I think I evolved because I wanted to show the many layers of what women actually go through. You are qualified, you've been in the corporate space, but circumstances compel you. Maybe you have a kid, you don't have somebody to watch over the kid, or whatever. You've dropped out of the workforce. How do you find purpose in life? K. Mehra does want purpose in life, but she's not willing to go back to the corporate world because she's not willing to leave her little kid back home for whatever reasons. Therefore, she gets enmeshed in all this. First is the petty politics of the society. The gated community of Mumbai is also a strong character, I would say, in the books. And then the murders as circumstantially as they keep happening. So it's just natural curiosity and the drive to find some purpose for K. Mehra. That's about it.
Okay. So you speak about this gated community and Bombay. And Tarun, I'll turn to you now and we'll just focus on the sort of whole question of every city or every major city at least having its own unique detective and its own unique crime DNA in a sense. I mean, if I look at the sort of international thing, say you have somebody like Rebus, you know, who's so depressive, etc., and the cold, sort of rainy weather of Edinburgh actually sort of connects with that in a sense. And again, and the same goes with the crime imprint, for example. So if you've seen the Dawson series set in Accra, I mean, it's very easy to get murdered in Accra. High energy place, rules meant to be broken place. Somebody's got, very quickly somebody will die. You have that feeling all the time. Or if you look at Bangkok, say, the way John Burdett looks at it, Detective Sonchai is there because, I mean, he can only thrive in this because of the mix of spiritual and profane that Bangkok is. In US, for example, in US picture, you will find more of gun crimes. In Scandinavian, less so. So every place, every location has its own detective, its own unique crime DNA, etc. From your sort of scan of this whole Indian detective fiction, what is the crime DNA of the various cities that you've found and the unique characteristics of detectives belonging to particular cities and spaces?
Yeah, interesting. So let's take a step back first and think back again to the origins of the form when industrialization was taking place and the industrial city came into being for the first time. And at that moment, you have floods of workers coming into the city, migrants, a great deal of anonymity, a great deal of loneliness. And it's that kind of city context which is captured in the early works of detective fiction. The city as a labyrinth, the city as a maze in which it's so difficult to find purchase. And in this labyrinth, it's the detective who is the interpreter, the detective who provides a possibility of mediation, or at least some kind of at least provisional solution for the manifold anxieties and the sense of disorder that is otherwise prevalent. So that's the 19th century context. I think that travels over into our context as well. Colonial modernity first, of course, touched the shores of India in the coastal regions. So Kolkata and Chennai and Mumbai, of course, become the kind of cities where we have, especially Kolkata to begin with, as we have already seen, with the tradition of the Bengali detective fiction taking root there. And whether it's Sharad Chandra, whether it's Satyajit Ray, so many stories actually capture the character of that evolving city space, where the city is a place of menace. It's a place of manifold dangers, but somehow there is the detective's figure somewhere in the picture seeking to provide succor. In this case, of course, the amateur figure, the figure whom we can rely on to wield his wits quite literally and solve the puzzle for us. Subsequently, though, and I would say this especially with reference to Mumbai, since Mumbai has already been referred to, I think Mumbai has sort of also generated a certain kind of writing which is closer to the noir tradition. That is to say, it's darker. The city is a place where there are many unresolved enigmas which may never be solved. So I see this especially in the context, say, of the work of Vikram Chandra. So Vikram Chandra's Sacred Games, and before that, the story which we've included is Kama, actually map the city sort of bylanes, the spaces of the city in which very unholy currents flow, really. So it's a city which is actually constantly metamorphosing into something new. And even the detective is unable sometimes to quite resolve the issues at stake. He can provide a partial, perhaps, glimpse into the truth. But it's not like Saradindu's truth seeker. You remember that Saradindu Bandyopadhyay actually thought of his detective Vyomkesh Bakshi as a truth seeker. And at the end of the day, usually the truth was disclosed. But here, the disclosure may be an ambivalent one. So I think especially Mumbai is we're getting to see, because of perhaps its cosmopolitan history, a figure like Ambai. Now she is from a regional context of writing. She writes in Tamil. Luckily, her works have been very ably translated by Geeta Subramanian. And she situates her stories in this context of the metropolis of Mumbai, where she's looking at the subaltern groups, she's looking at marginal communities, sometimes, say, the LGBTQ community, as in the case of the story in our volume. And she's not so much interested in, again, detection for detection's sake, but rather the personal dimension, the complexities within families and personal spaces. So it becomes about character. It becomes, again, closer to literary fiction, if you like. But yeah, she's able to kind of create a bridge between the two spaces. So Delhi, well, we've recently seen Nilanjana Roy's Black River, again, providing a kind of cartography of that city. Bangalore, you've had Anita Nair and, of course, Harini, Nagendra in their own way contributing to a kind of sense of the kind of mysteriousness of the new urban spaces, which are evolving into something which we can't quite grasp yet. It's grotesque. It's marked by a certain new kind of indefinable, again, sense of menace and danger. So those are the qualities which I see, which we can associate, I think, with pretty much every city, especially with the advent of liberalization. That's perhaps provided a spur to the imagination of detective fiction writers who've written about the churning and the greater degree of turmoil in Indian city life, especially. Again, that's not to say, one last point, that's not to say that the hinterlands have been ignored altogether, because what happens in the city ultimately has its bearing on the hinterland. So we have hinterland noir as well, beginning to sort of appear. Even in Nilanjana Roy's novel, Black River, a significant section of the novel is actually located. The main murder, in fact, takes place off-center, not in Delhi, but in the rural hinterlands of Delhi. So these are some of the tendencies or trends. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this sort of spillover to the hinterland, because in your collection also you have stories set in Himachal and in rural Punjab and in the northeast, etc., where some of the sort of menace and corruption of the cities has obviously reached. Not that these were unspoiled sort of places in the first place, but yeah, the city variant of crime, let's say, has reached there. Coming to you and Mumbai, I mean, and Tarun mentions this whole thing about, and which is true, which we all know is true in some senses, that every square inch of the city is a conceivable crime location. It could happen. Things could happen there. Now, as someone who sort of moves about, and you stay in Mumbai, you move about there, do you as a writer see regular spaces that, well, other people might see as regular spaces as places where something unpleasant could happen? People walking about, others might just see them as people walking about, and you might think of them as, maybe this person is capable of something sinister. And bring in those readings, etc., to your writing. Does it happen, or is a walk just a walk?
So I write about Temple Hill, which is a fictitious neighborhood in Mumbai, a very privileged, green Gujarati neighborhood, peppered with temples and all of that. So I've grown up there. Now, if I'm just walking about, no, that doesn't happen, because that would mean I need some kind of help somewhere. But yes, when I'm meeting people, often, Kiran and I were just talking about it, there'll be an auntie who says, oh, you're writing for a living now? Good, keep yourself busy. So earlier I would get infuriated with these sort of comments. Now these characters that I encounter on Temple Hill, they go into my books. So there's this one uncle in the gym. Every time he does a squat, he disses the government. Squatting there and he's dissing the government. And he's very active on Twitter and all of that. Now, and he's so loud that I can't hear my music. And it's unpleasant, honestly, early at 7:30 in the morning to hear his agenda. He's going into my book. So those people are going into my book, but no, I don't walk about the city thinking, this is a nice green park, let's plan a murder here. But having said that, the interesting thing about Temple Hill is that it's a Jain neighborhood. Now, if anyone's familiar with even the most basic tenet of Jainism, it is ahimsa, which means non-violence. So it was interesting for me to use that as a backdrop for my stories. So these places I'm intimately familiar with. I've grown up there. But imagine a place where the basic tenet of people, like I remember telling you about this, if you're walking down the slopes of Temple Hill, Malabar Hill actually, you'll sometimes find people walking barefoot. They're going to the temple. It's close by. And does anyone know why people walk barefoot to the temples? Does anyone, I mean, I would love to know if anyone knows. Correct. So it's not out of respect to the god, but it is for the respect of the ant or any insect's life. So that's the kind of non-violence people practice. So imagine that being a backdrop for murders. So that's what's the thinking.
Okay. And you're Mumbai, Kiran. You know, I mean, let's see how cities came into play in detective fiction. Essentially, when it was the golden age fiction, let's say, where there's something that happens out in the hinterland, it sort of causes a social upheaval, the detective crimes solves the crime, and, you know, some kind of balance is restored and things go happily for a while. The city is a recurrent crime canvas, you know. You solve a crime, it doesn't mean anything, you know, it will happen again. Because the forces triggering the crime are very strong and the forces meant to check them are very corrupt, right? So when I look, I'm also aware of your voice on questions of justice and development. You're very strong on those. You talk a lot about those. You're very, very vocal about lots of things. And yet, with K-Mehra and the series, you've chosen to have the golden age fiction feels. You know, you haven't burdened your principal detective with quote unquote bigger agendas and so on. Conscious choice? Because, but aisa kyun? Or do you want another detective who will be more sort of hard-boiled, etc.?
So, K-Mehra is not me.
All right.
I'm a different person. K-Mehra is a different person. And K-Mehra is not going to be burdened by the things that I'm burdened by. Having said that, I think I was very influenced by P.G. Wodehouse. I'm a total Wodehouse addict. I think it shows in the writing sometimes. And the Wodehouse universe is a very sanitized, a very happy universe. There are no serious issues happening. Bertie Wooster never ages. He's in the same space throughout. Jeeves never ages. All the characters remain suspended in suspended animation for a while. And I think that's what I try to replicate in the K-Mehra series, that they are living in a timeless bubble, but things keep happening to them and things get resolved. And it's funny and it's light. I just wanted it to be a book that somebody could read and get their mind off things. When I want to disturb people, I write a different kind of a book.
But how difficult or easy is it for you to keep this sort of compartmentalization in your head and while you're writing?
Manish, I write across genres. So I write psychological thriller, horror, science fiction, non-fiction, comic mystery, romance, chick lit, everything. How difficult is it? I've never really planned it. It's just that I think I have a very low boredom threshold and I read extensively across all genres. And as a journalist, I got used to doing the business beat, to doing the civic beat, the crime beat, feature writing. So I've done that all. So I think my training ground was journalism, but I did everything. So it just makes it a little easier.
Okay. We've got 20 minutes left. I'll just try to squeeze in a question for each of you before we go to the audience. And one common question. Tarun, one of the most sort of, for me at least, one of the most fascinating, some of the most fascinating stories in your collection are the ones that are set in the future. Mm-hmm. And it just points to how difficult it is going to be to solve crime in the future, where you could, I mean, among other things, one could basically erase a victim as if they were never there. You could manipulate evidence digitally to show a person in a different place. many, and you could murder somebody by distance, think drones, for example. I mean, all sorts of things. Or you will need super sleuths who are capable of shape-shifting, time travel, etc. How do you, and this is a question to all of you, and Tarun first, and then you guys can come in. How do you see Indian detective fiction sort of dealing with this kind of future? And I'm asking this for two reasons. One is Indian detective fiction in general has not gone very big on forensics. The science is generally not there. That's one. The second thing is that one has heard, for example, you talked about hinterland detective fiction, etc., but also TV writers saying that, because urban areas are so over-surveilled, they are tempted to write about rural areas where it is more difficult to track crime and solve crime and so on. So given those sort of things, how do you see Indian detective fiction responding to this whole question of the kind of crimes that we will see in the future? Or maybe we'll just see backdated stories and historical fiction more. I don't know. Tarun first, then Kiran, and then Miti.
Sure, yeah. So I would say that, firstly, it's interesting to note how there has been an attempt to synthesize, hybridize science fiction and detective fiction in the stories which you mentioned, which are there in the volume, including Kiran's story, of course. So there we have some of the traditional tropes and devices of science fiction, such as, for example, extrapolation. So writers don't necessarily have to be right with their predictions, though there have been some writers of science fiction who have got it absolutely right. There are others who've got it absolutely wrong. Arthur C. Clarke certainly predicted the emergence on the scene of telecommunication and satellites and so on and so forth. But William Gibson famously was not quite able to predict the exact contours of how cyberspace would look. So I guess when a science fiction writer works with the available tech of his or her time and tries to extrapolate, it's based on the given state of the art of the tech which he or she is familiar with. And in this case, I think what's interesting about these stories, because they're sort of synthesizing crime elements, detective fiction elements with these science fictional elements, there's a certain kind of freshness to the narratives about crimes of the future. Because it's not just dystopian, though there is certainly a dystopian vision often underlying the kind of basic storyline. But there's a sense that, for example, new techniques may have to be devised, as in Shumit Bardhan's story. New kinds of modes of training algorithms may have to be devised, where then the projection of an algorithm into a futuristic simulation may be the way to go with respect to training that algorithm to become independent. And that opens up the whole question again of AI and the future of artificial intelligence, which again is explored in another of the stories by Naveen Veeraratne, with ChatGPT and such kinds of forms of tech coming along the way, which also have their implications in the realm of sexuality and the creation of digital forms of satisfaction, of sometimes even very perverse forms of satisfaction in the realm of erotica and so on. So it's fascinating to see how these trends and tendencies of the moment are transformed effectively and imaginatively through these kinds of projections. The question of time travel, well, time travel may never be achieved. But I think both Kiran's story and Kehkeshan's story very nicely imagine that possibility of, yes, fixing of problems through the use of a detective who actually possesses the tech to actually travel through time, which might actually result in very complex ethical dilemmas because of the question of the split self, as in Kiran's story, and to an extent also in Kehkeshan's story. So yes, the dilemmas will continue to become more and more labyrinthine and complex. And I think these particular modes will respond accordingly and hopefully come up with very interesting imaginative solutions. So, thank you.
Thank you. Kiran.
That's a very, very interesting question, and I don't know if I have an adequate answer because right now, to be very honest, Manish, we are on this cusp of this massive explosion of AI happening. We don't know what is going to happen and how it's going to take us. I think we're all just observing and waiting to watch which direction it goes. Is it going to take over humans? Are we going to have Terminator happening in a few hundred years? Are we going to be shifting out on interstellar arcs? What is going to happen to humanity per se? Forget detective fiction. Is climate change going to drown us all? These are questions I think all of us are grappling with. And I mean, we've had dystopian fiction focusing on climate change. I think detective fiction will also somehow veer towards that because these are the larger questions that we're grappling. Immortality. We have a gentleman called Brian Johnson. I don't know if anyone has heard of him. His aim is to never die. And he's biohacking himself to do so. All the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are investing massively in programs to delay aging. But there are so many ethical ramifications that are coming up with delaying aging. What do you do when the population is increasing so much and people are refusing to die? Where is the space in the world for everybody? The food in the world, the resources. So I think all this will somehow pour into our fiction, detective fiction included. And the crimes are going to be crimes that we right now are sitting on the edge of the precipice, not even able to comprehend what the crimes of the future are going to be like. So it's a very interesting phase we are at, and it's a very premature phase. I think in 10 years, the kind of fiction that we see will be radically different because the leaps that AI and technology are going to take are going to be so vast, we can't even imagine or begin to predict it right now.
I'm wondering if if murder doesn't happen, I mean, even if somebody gets murdered and they can be brought to life, what's the point of murder? Take it. Yeah, Niti.
So everything that Kiran said, that.
Okay.
And so my take is that, yes, like the way fiction has evolved, detective fiction, it'll continue to, meaning, for instance, the deepfake videos we are seeing now, the nature of those crimes, and then there'll be new laws and regulations placed around that. So the policies are changing. So when the crimes change, the laws change, and the method of detecting those crimes change, all that will continue happening, and I'm certainly not in a position to predict what kind of technology we'll see. But what I do know is that there is a reason people read detective fiction. At the end of it, there's a sense of justice that prevails. There's a sense that all is right with this world. Whether things are fair in real life, we don't know, but in the book, at the end, the murderer is caught, he's punished, and that sense of things being right, that is the reason, I think the very primal reason, even if people want to intellectualize it as much as they want, but that's a very primal reason people are reading detective fiction, and I don't think that reason changes much, because it's very instinctual. Second, to your point about forensics not being used much, about so there are very practical considerations for it, and as a writer, I have faced this. We don't have enough out there in the public domain for writers to do the kind of research required to make a book credible. Internationally, in the UK and all, there are cops, ex-cops, there are lawyers who'll say, we're going to do a 2-day workshop, ask me anything about the legalities or about forensics or about the procedural aspects of crime. We don't have that here. So unless I actually know a cop and request him to tell him, I have Googled these things, and called an autopsy, what's the other word for it? So I've called it an autopsy, and then have had a very hawkish reviewer say, by the way, it's called a postmortem in India. But because our knowledge comes from reading UK fiction, for example, we go ahead and call our things autopsies. So that's the other reason why some of this stuff you don't see so much in Indian fiction.
But interesting point about how crime has shaped law and legal codes and so on. So that's there. Plus, of course, you also have criminals making laws these days, so in parliament and so on. But having said that, now we'll open the floor to the audience. Folks, anybody, any reflections, thoughts, questions of any of our three panelists?
One would assume that without a murder, there cannot be a detective story. I mean, at least vast majority is, central theme is a murder, right? And you just mentioned at the beginning, the real life, detectives hardly do any murder investigation. There are a lot of other things they do. Now, of the people, authors that I know, maybe if you read Conan Doyle, hardly any of his murders, there are hardly any story which has a murder. There's got a huge things from a stolen horse, I mean a horse or a blackmail or some art theft or things. Now, my question is, why isn't that detective writers explore all those things, all the other aspects of this thing, which, like for example, it can be anything, art theft, it can be blackmail, it can be kidnapping, and what. But why don't detective writers explore those? And again, the last question and the replies was, in future that people are going to do a lot more, take up a lot more subjects as a central plot of their the stories.
You have a fair number of stories where murder is not the central plot. I have a book that is with a publisher where murder is not the central plot. It is a kidnapping. So it's not necessarily a murder. It's just that the murders are more salacious to the reader. So, and they get the reader invested more quickly. You know, a bank heist is there. We have Ravi Subramaniam who writes wonderful thrillers. There are no detectives involved per se. I mean, there is somebody who investigates the crime, but they are basically white-collar crimes. V. Raman writes those as well. I can think of a book by Amrita Chaudhary, which was about an art heist, which was written a long time ago, an Amrita Shergill fake, and it was set in the art world. So we do have those books also, where it isn't necessarily one dead body and then somebody coming to investigate. But those are few and far between. On the whole, I think basically murder is the primary theme.
Also, I think Arthur Conan Doyle, if I'm not mistaken, wrote mainly more of short stories, which are easier to engage the reader when the crime is a small crime, and then you get to the answer quicker. When you're writing a full-length novel, you need something bigger, bolder, and as Kiran said, salacious.
So, since truth is stranger than fiction, anybody else has a question? Otherwise, I have a little puzzle for the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
So murder need not be associated with a blood spread or explosives. So considering the scenario of where you have poor medical loss, right?
Can't hear you.
Okay, so I just want to say that murder need not be associated with any blood spread or use of explosives. So considering the poor medical loss, right, it could be very easy to take away one's life. So how can fictional stories, bring some provoking or brainstorming, content in the narratives?
Speaking about the ways to murder somebody?
Not exactly, but if you look at the recent COVID, we lost millions of people. So most of them could have been saved with a proper medical timely care.
That's a different kind of murder.
That's a murder at levels we can't even get into in our fiction.
If I may come in and just add a quick word, Kathy Reichs actually has a training as a forensic anthropologist, and that's of course one of the assets to with respect to her writing career, that she draws on her own experience of being someone who has worked in the labs and dissected corpses, performed postmortems, etc. So yeah, you have some writing like that, but not much in the context of India. I just wanted to say in response to the young man's question as well, that definitions of crime change with time. It's not as if you have a kind of set conception of criminality which has existed for all time and all throughout history. I mean, if you read the works of the subaltern historians, you'll realize what I mean when you read the work of, say, Shahid Amin on, the Chauri Chaura incident, which was, of course, deemed a crime by the British state. But after all, from our point of view, now we would regard it as one of the first instances of revolt, kind of early instance of nationalist struggle. So there are these complexities as regards the relationship between the legal system and what is justice. We have inherited a highly imperfect legal system from the British, in fact, which has been tinkered with over a period of time, but there's still so many institutional imperfections. And I think some of those issues are beginning to be addressed in some of the good crime fiction that is now emerging. The limitations of individuals, even police officers with consciences, who are dealing with the institutional imperfections and the institutional corruption, which Manish also mentioned, and the inability to push things to the logical conclusion, which often leads people to step outside the judicial system and sometimes take law into their own hands. So the idea of justice, therefore, the idea of a higher justice sometimes underpins some of those very interesting narratives, some of which I think we had the pleasure of including in our.
Okay, so it's time to call it a wrap. I have one question for the audience. You guys can figure it out as you go out. A puzzle, really, based on a real life thing. So it so happens that a diamond merchant's child is kidnapped, and the ransom is a diamond that this person is supposed to leave to get to a particular phone booth in the city. He informs the cops. Cops in plain clothes are all around the phone booth. He goes and gives the diamond. The diamond goes away. The kidnappers aren't caught. And so what happened? Puzzle for you to figure out. Don't Google. If you can do it in the next 30 seconds, you get something from Pooja and company. And the kidnappers are not caught. The diamond goes away. And the merchant and the cops are doing no mischief. That I don't know. The child, well, it actually happened with a car and the car was returned. It happened with many cars and the cars were returned. Starts now. You want to take a guess? Uh-huh.
Diamond was put into the payphone slot, something like that.
Not bad. Okay, so time's up anyway. You need to wrap. Basically, they used the criminals used to use a homing pigeon. So the pigeon used to sit. You need to put the diamond in the pouch, and the pigeon flies off to the criminal. This was a standard MO for car theft in Taiwan in the 90s. Many cars stolen, the keys would be given back as long as the owners give the deposit, put in the money and give it to a pigeon who used to carry it back. Have a good day, all of you.